The summer heat pressed down upon Riverside Manor like a physical weight, the humid air clinging to the skin of everyone unfortunate enough to be outdoors. For most of the plantation's inhabitants, there was no choice but to endure it. In the cotton fields that stretched to the horizon, dozens of enslaved people toiled under the merciless Mississippi sun, backs bent, fingers bleeding from the sharp cotton bolls. But inside the grand white mansion, with its imposing columns and sprawling verandas, Eleanor Hargrove sat in relative comfort, a delicate china teacup balanced in her slender hand. At 22, Eleanor was the sole heir to Riverside, one of Natchez County's most profitable cotton plantations. Her father, Colonel William Hargrove, had died the previous winter of a sudden fever, leaving his unmarried daughter in possession of over 2,000 acres of prime Mississippi land and the 100 souls who worked it. Eleanor's mother had passed when she was just 7, leaving the girl to be raised by her stern, uncompromising father and a succession of governesses. "More tea, Miss Eleanor?" The house servant, Mary, stood at her elbow, eyes downcast as custom demanded. "No, thank you, Mary. That will be all for now." Eleanor's voice was soft but clear, her accent betraying her education at a prestigious finishing school in Philadelphia. 4 years away from Riverside had changed Eleanor in ways that were becoming increasingly evident to those around her. As Mary departed, Eleanor's gaze drifted out the window to the stables, where a tall, broad-shouldered man was leading a magnificent chestnut mare into the yard. Despite his status as an enslaved man, Isaiah had been appointed head stable master by Colonel Hargrove himself, who had recognized the young man's exceptional way with horses. At 30, Isaiah's skin was darkened further by constant exposure to the sun, his muscular frame a testament to years of physical labor. Yet there was a dignity in his bearing that no amount of oppression had managed to diminish. Eleanor watched him work, admiring the gentle way he handled the spirited horse. She had known Isaiah her entire life. He had been born on Riverside, the son of the previous stable master. When she was a child, he had taught her to ride, despite her father's initial objections. Their shared love of horses had formed a connection that transcended the brutal social boundaries of their time. A sharp knock at the parlor door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, reluctantly tearing her eyes away from the window. Mr. Phineas Thornton stepped into the room, removing his hat with a flourish. At 45, Thornton was one of Natchez's most successful cotton brokers, a widower with a reputation for shrewd business dealings and a prosperous shipping connection to the textile mills of England. "Miss Hargrove, you are as radiant as ever," he declared, his small eyes taking in her appearance with poorly disguised avarice. "Mr. Thornton, what an unexpected pleasure," Eleanor replied, her tone carefully neutral. Since her father's death, Thornton had been increasingly persistent in his attentions, his interest clearly divided between her personal charms and the substantial business opportunity Riverside represented. "I was passing by and thought I might inquire about your decision regarding my proposal." Thornton took a seat without waiting to be invited, placing his hat on a nearby table. Eleanor's expression remained composed, though her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her teacup. "As I mentioned when last we spoke, Mr. Thornton, I require more time to consider such a significant decision. My father's death was less than 6 months ago." Thornton's smile did not reach his eyes. "Of course, my dear. However, I must stress that a young woman in your position faces considerable challenges managing an estate of this size. The responsibility is enormous, and the social implications of a woman alone overseeing such a large number of slaves could invite unwelcome gossip." "I am well aware of my responsibilities, Mr. Thornton," Eleanor replied, her voice cooler now. "My father ensured I was educated in all aspects of plantation management. Education is one thing, Miss Hargrove. Experience is quite another." Thornton leaned forward, his voice lowering conspiratorially. "There have already been whispers in town. Questions about your methods. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. My methods? It has been noticed that you have relaxed certain disciplines on Riverside. The church service you permitted last Sunday, for instance. Many consider it dangerous to allow the slaves to gather in such numbers without white supervision. The service was conducted by Reverend Miller from town, Eleanor countered, and I failed to see how Christian worship could pose a threat to anyone. Thornton's expression hardened slightly. Such naivety is precisely my concern. These are volatile times, Miss Hargrove. The abolitionists grow bolder by the day. Just last month, a plantation in Louisiana was found to be harboring a cell of runaways. The owner claimed ignorance, but his property was nonetheless burned to the ground as a warning. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine, despite the heat of the day. Thornton's words were delivered casually, but the threat beneath them was unmistakable. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Thornton, but I assure you, Riverside is well managed. She rose gracefully, signaling the end of their conversation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have matters requiring my attention. Thornton stood, reclaiming his hat. Of course, but do consider my offer, Miss Hargrove. Marriage would provide you with both protection and respectability, and I believe we could be very compatible. His gaze lingered on her figure in a way that made Eleanor's skin crawl. After seeing Thornton out, Eleanor retreated to her father's study, her study now, and closed the door firmly behind her. The room remained largely as the Colonel had left it, with its heavy mahogany desk, leather-bound books, and the faint smell of tobacco still clinging to the drapes. She crossed to the window, which offered a clear view of the stables. Isaiah was still working with the mare, his movements patient and assured. As though sensing her gaze, he looked up, their eyes meeting briefly across the distance before Eleanor stepped back from the window, her heart racing inexplicably. That evening, as the plantation settled into its nighttime rhythms, Eleanor sat at her dressing table while Mary gently brushed her long chestnut hair. Through the open window came the distant sound of singing, soft, haunting melodies rising from the slave quarters beyond the main house. "They're singing for Jacob," Mary said quietly, her hands never pausing in their work. Eleanor met Mary's eyes in the mirror. Jacob. Mary's expression remained carefully neutral. He was whipped today. Overseer Simmons caught him with a book. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Mr. Simmons whipped a man for reading. It's the law, Miss Eleanor. Mary's voice was barely above a whisper. Has been since the rebellion scare of 32. No teaching slaves to read or write. Eleanor knew this, of course. The restrictions had been enacted across the South following Nat Turner's rebellion, when a literate enslaved preacher had led an uprising that resulted in the deaths of over 50 white people. The laws were born of fear that education would inevitably lead to resistance. How badly was he hurt? Eleanor asked, her voice strained. 20 lashes. He'll live, but he won't be working for a few days. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, a wave of shame washing over her. This was her plantation now. These were her responsibilities. Every act of cruelty carried out in the name of maintaining order at Riverside occurred under her authority. Thank you, Mary. That will be all for tonight. After Mary departed, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. The singing had stopped, but its echo seemed to linger in the thick night air. On an impulse, she rose, slipped a light robe over her nightgown, and made her way downstairs. The great house was silent, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She unlocked the side door and stepped out into the night. The moon was nearly full, casting a silvery light over the manicured gardens surrounding the house. Beyond them lay the working areas of the plantation, the cotton gin, the storehouses, the quarters. Eleanor had rarely ventured to that part of Riverside, especially after dark. A soft nicker drew her attention to the stables. The mare they had been working with earlier was restless in her stall. Eleanor approached, speaking softly to the nervous animal. "Easy, girl. What's troubling you tonight? She doesn't like being confined. Isaiah's voice came from the shadows, startling Eleanor so badly she nearly cried out. He stepped forward, his expression guarded. "Forgive me, Miss Eleanor. I didn't mean to frighten you." "What are you doing here at this hour?" she asked, her hand pressed to her racing heart. "I sleep here," he replied simply, "in the loft. Been that way since your father made me head stable master." Eleanor nodded, remembering this arrangement. Her father had wanted someone close to the valuable horses at all times. The mare, as she knew, arrived yesterday from Kentucky, fine bloodline but spirited. She needs a gentle hand. Eleanor approached the stall, holding her palm out to the horse, who sniffed it cautiously before allowing her to stroke its velvety nose. "What's her name?" "Your father called her Tempest in his correspondence, but she hasn't been formally named yet. That would be for you to decide now." Eleanor studied the beautiful animal, noting the intelligent gleam in her dark eyes. "Liberty," she said softly. "I think I'll call her Liberty." Isaiah's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. A fine name. They stood in silence for a moment, the mare between them. Eleanor was acutely aware of the impropriety of her situation. Alone in the stables at night, with an enslaved man, dressed only in her nightclothes. If anyone were to discover them, the scandal would be enormous, yet she felt no fear. Isaiah had been part of her life for as long as she could remember. He had taught her to ride, had once caught her when she fell from her first pony, had always treated her with a respect that seemed to exist separate from the forced deference his position demanded. "I heard about Jacob," she said finally, her voice low. "About the whipping." Isaiah tensed visibly, his gaze dropping. "That's not for me to discuss, Miss Eleanor. It happened on my plantation, Isaiah. That makes it very much my concern." Her voice was firmer now, reminiscent of her father's authoritative tone. "Then perhaps you should speak to Mr. Simmons," Isaiah suggested, his voice carefully neutral. "He administers the discipline here." "At my direction," Eleanor countered. "Or at least that should be the case." She hesitated, then asked, "Was Jacob truly reading?" Isaiah was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing his response. "Yes," he finally said, "a page torn from a Bible. He's been trying to learn for years." Eleanor felt ill. A man whipped bloody for attempting to read scripture. The hypocrisy was staggering. The same white society that professed Christian values denying enslaved people access to the very words they claimed were sacred. "Things will be different now," she found herself saying. The words emerged before she had fully formed the thought, but as soon as they were spoken, she knew she meant them. Isaiah looked at her directly then, his dark eyes searching her face. "Different how, Miss Eleanor?" It was a dangerous question. For him to ask, for her to answer. They both knew it. The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken possibilities and dangers. Before Eleanor could respond, a sound from outside the stable caught their attention, the crunch of gravel under a boot. Isaiah immediately stepped back, putting appropriate distance between them just as the stable door creaked open. Overseer Simmons stood framed in the doorway, his whip coiled at his side. His gaze moved from Eleanor to Isaiah, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Well now," he drawled, "what have we here?" Eleanor straightened her posture, drawing her robe tighter around herself. "I was checking on the new mare, Mr. Simmons. I couldn't sleep and heard her restlessness from the house." The lie came easily, though her heart pounded against her ribs. Simmons' gaze remained skeptical, his eyes moving between her and Isaiah with obvious suspicion. At 40, Josiah Simmons had served as Riverside's overseer for nearly 15 years. Colonel Hargrove had valued his efficiency, even if his methods were often brutal. Tall and wiry, with a perpetually sunburned face and cold, pale eyes, Simmons had a reputation for maintaining order through fear. "Bit late for horse inspection, ain't it, Miss Hargrove?" His tone was just short of insolent. Since her father's death, Simmons had grown increasingly bold in questioning her decisions. "I don't believe I need to explain my movements on my own property, Mr. Simmons." Eleanor kept her voice level, channeling her father's authoritative manner. Isaiah was simply assisting me. Simmons's smile didn't reach his eyes. Course he was, just doing his duty. He turned his gaze to Isaiah. Ain't that right, boy? Isaiah's face was an expressionless mask, his eyes downcast. Yes, sir. Well, Miss Hargrove, since you're up and about, might be a good time to discuss some matters regarding the plantation in private. Simmons emphasized the last two words, his implication clear. Eleanor nodded stiffly. Very well. We can speak in the morning office after breakfast tomorrow. As you wish, ma'am. Simmons touched his hat in a gesture of deference that somehow managed to convey its opposite. I'll escort you back to the house. Wouldn't want you walking alone at night. All manner of dangers out here. Eleanor had no choice but to accept his company. As they left the stable, she risked a brief glance back at Isaiah, who remained perfectly still, his eyes following her departure. The walk back to the main house was silent and tense. At the side door, Eleanor thanked Simmons curtly and was about to step inside when his voice stopped her. Miss Hargrove. His tone had shifted, lower now, more intimate in a way that made her skin crawl. I've served Riverside faithful for 15 years. Your father trusted me completely. I'm aware of your service, Mr. Simmons. Then you should also be aware that there are delicate aspects to managing the property. Things a young lady such as yourself shouldn't have to concern herself with. He moved a step closer. I could take that burden from you. Handle everything. All you'd need to do is trust my judgment. Eleanor held her ground, though her instinct was to retreat. I appreciate your offer, Mr. Simmons, but as I've said to Mr. Thornton and others, I'm quite capable of managing my inheritance. Simmons's expression hardened. Managing an estate like this requires a firm hand, Miss Hargrove. The darkies need to know their place. Your father understood that. My father is dead, Mr. Simmons, and Riverside is now under my direction. If you wish to continue in your position, you will respect that fact. With that, Eleanor stepped inside and closed the door firmly, turning the key in the lock. Only when she was alone in her bedroom did she allow herself to tremble, the full weight of her situation crashing down upon her. She was surrounded by men who viewed her as incapable or as a means to acquire her property, men like Thornton, who masked their ambition behind courtship, or Simmons, who believed he could intimidate her into ceding control. And then there was Isaiah. Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape of Riverside. In the distance, she could just make out the slave quarters, simple wooden structures where over 100 human beings lived in conditions she had never truly allowed herself to examine closely. She had been raised in the peculiar hypocrisy of Southern gentility, taught that the enslavement of other human beings was both a necessary economic reality and divinely sanctioned. Yet her years at school in Philadelphia had exposed her to different ideas. She had met abolitionists, had read pamphlets that described in unflinching detail the horrors of the system that provided her comfortable existence. Eleanor had returned to Riverside upon her father's summons, dutifully taking her place as the plantation mistress. But something within her had changed. A seed of doubt that had taken root and now threatened to blossom into dangerous conviction. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind filled with conflicting thoughts and emotions. By dawn, she had made a decision. If she was truly mistress of Riverside now, then certain changes would be made, beginning immediately. Breakfast was served promptly at 8, as always. Eleanor ate little, her stomach tight with anticipation of the confrontation to come. At 9, she made her way to the morning office, a small room off the main hall, where her father had conducted the daily business of the plantation. Simmons was waiting, hat in hand, a ledger tucked under his arm. Morning, Miss Hargrove. Good morning, Mr. Simmons. Please sit. Eleanor took her place behind the desk, drawing strength from the familiar piece of furniture that had been her father's for so many years. I want to discuss yesterday's incident with Jacob, she began without preamble. Simmons shifted in his chair. Nothing to discuss, ma'am. caught him with written materials. Law's clear on that point. The punishment seems excessive for the offence. Simmons's eyes narrowed slightly. 20 lashes is standard, Miss Hargrove. Your father would have ordered the same. Perhaps, Eleanor conceded, but my father is no longer making these decisions. She met his gaze directly. From now on, all punishments must be approved by me before they are carried out. Is that understood? A flush crept up Simmons's neck. With all due respect, ma'am, that ain't practical. Discipline needs to be swift to be effective. Can't have me running to the big house every time one of them needs correction. Nevertheless, that is how it will be done. Eleanor's tone left no room for argument. Additionally, I want Jacob relieved of field duties until he has healed properly. He'll be fit for work by tomorrow, when the plantation doctor confirms he is healed, not before. Eleanor maintained her composure, though her heart was racing. Each assertion of authority was a test. Would Simmons accept her leadership or challenge it? The overseer's jaw worked, as though he were physically restraining his words. Finally, he gave a curt nod. As you wish, ma'am. Eleanor wasn't finished. I also want to discuss the living conditions in the quarters. The roofs need repair before the rainy season, and the well nearest to the cabins has become contaminated. Simmons scoffed. Those repairs would cost. I'm well aware of the costs, Mr. Simmons. I've reviewed the accounts. This was true. Eleanor had spent many nights since her father's death studying the plantation's financial records. Riverside can afford these improvements, and they will be made. The meeting continued for another hour, with Eleanor outlining several other changes she intended to implement. By the end, Simmons's face was a rigid mask of barely contained anger, but he had not openly defied her. It was a small victory, but Eleanor harbored no illusions that the war was won. Simmons would test her resolve at every opportunity. As the overseer departed, she called after him, "Send Isaiah to me, please. I wish to discuss the new mayor." Simmons paused at the door, his back stiffening. "The stable boy." "The head stable master," Eleanor corrected firmly. After Simmons left, Eleanor exhaled slowly, releasing the tension she had been holding throughout the confrontation. She moved to the window, watching as the overseer stalked across the yard toward the stables, his entire posture radiating fury. 20 minutes later, a knock sounded at the office door. "Enter," Eleanor called, composing herself. Isaiah stepped inside, removing his worn cap. His expression was guarded, giving nothing away. "You asked to see me, Miss Eleanor." "Yes, Isaiah. Please, close the door." He did as instructed, though he remained standing near it, maintaining a respectful distance. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the fine dust motes floating in the air between them. "About last night," Eleanor began, "Mr. Simmons, he didn't see anything untoward, Miss Eleanor," Isaiah interrupted, his voice low. "I made sure of that." Eleanor nodded, grateful for his quick thinking. "Nevertheless, we must be more careful. There are those who would use any hint of impropriety to undermine my position here." Isaiah's gaze was steady. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor hesitated, then asked, "How is Jacob today?" A flicker of surprise crossed Isaiah's features before he masked it. "Healing, but in pain. Doctor hasn't been to see him yet." "He will," Eleanor assured him. "I've given instructions to Simmons. Jacob is to rest until properly healed." Isaiah nodded, his expression still carefully neutral, though something like cautious hope flickered in his eyes. "That's kind of you, Miss Eleanor." "It's not kindness, Isaiah. It's basic humanity." She moved away from the window, pacing the small room. "Things are going to change at Riverside. Slowly, perhaps, but they will change." Isaiah watched her, his posture still rigid, but his eyes intent on her face. "What kind of changes, Miss Eleanor?" It was a dangerous conversation, and they both knew it. What Eleanor was contemplating went beyond improving living conditions or moderating punishments. The thoughts that had kept her awake through the night were far more radical and far more dangerous. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about Jacob learning to read," she said carefully. "The Bible specifically." Isaiah remained silent, waiting. "I believe every person has the right to read God's word for themselves." Eleanor's voice grew firmer as she spoke. "To deny anyone that right seems blasphemous." "The law doesn't see it that way, Miss Eleanor." Isaiah's tone was cautious, but his eyes had intensified, focused completely on her now. "Some laws are unjust, Isaiah." The words hung in the air between them, treasonous in their implication. A long silence followed, the only sound the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant calls of field hands at work. When Isaiah finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Eleanor?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "For now, just one small step. I want you to bring Jacob to the summer kitchen after dark tonight. Tell no one else." Isaiah's expression remained carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the conflict in his eyes. Hope warring with suspicion, years of hard-learned caution battling against the possibility that she might genuinely mean what she was suggesting. "I'll bring him," he said finally. "But Miss Eleanor, if anyone discovers—" "They won't," she interrupted with more confidence than she felt. 9 o'clock. Use the back path through the orchard." After Isaiah left, Eleanor sank into her father's chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was contemplating. Teaching an enslaved person to read was a criminal offense in Mississippi, punishable by fines and imprisonment. If discovered, her reputation would be destroyed, her position in society forfeit, and the consequences for Isaiah and Jacob would be far worse. Yet the alternative, to continue perpetuating a system she increasingly recognized as evil, seemed unthinkable. The contradiction between her Christian upbringing and the reality of the institution that supported her privileged existence had become impossible to ignore. That evening, as darkness fell over Riverside, Eleanor made her way to the summer kitchen, a separate building used during the hottest months to keep cooking heat away from the main house. Now, in early spring, it stood empty, the perfect place for a clandestine meeting. She lit a single lamp, placing it on the worn wooden table, and waited. The night was unseasonably cool, a light breeze stirring the trees outside. In the distance, she could hear the soft, rhythmic singing that often rose from the quarters after dark. Songs of sorrow, of faith, of coded messages and double meanings that the white residents of Riverside had never bothered to decipher. At precisely 9 o'clock, the door creaked open. Isaiah entered first, his tall frame silhouetted against the night sky. Behind him came Jacob, moving stiffly, his recent injuries clearly causing him pain. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 19 or 20, with intelligent eyes that widened in alarm when he saw her. "Miss Hargrove!" he exclaimed, immediately lowering his gaze. "I didn't know. Isaiah didn't say—" "It's all right, Jacob," Eleanor assured him. "Please, both of you, sit down." Neither man moved, their bodies tense with the ingrained knowledge that sitting in the presence of a white woman was a dangerous breach of etiquette. "Please," Eleanor repeated, her voice gentler now. "What I have to say is best discussed as equals." Isaiah was the first to move, cautiously taking a seat at the rough-hewn table. After a moment's hesitation, Jacob followed suit, perching on the edge of the bench as though ready to flee at the slightest provocation. Eleanor reached into the basket she had brought, withdrawing a small, leather-bound volume. "I understand you wish to learn to read the Bible, Jacob." The young man's eyes widened, his gaze darting nervously between her and Isaiah. I was just curious, Miss Hargrove. I never meant no harm by it." "No harm was done," Eleanor said firmly, "and curiosity is not a sin, despite what Mr. Simmons might believe." She placed the book on the table between them. "This is a primer, a beginning reader. I used it as a child. We'll start with the alphabet." Jacob stared at the book as though it might burn him. You're going to teach me to read?" "Yes, and Isaiah as well, if he wishes to learn." Isaiah's expression remained carefully controlled, but his eyes were intense as they met hers across the table. "Why, Miss Eleanor? Why would you risk this?" It was a fair question, one Eleanor had been asking herself throughout the day. "Because it's right," she said simply. "Because denying knowledge to any human being is a sin greater than any law can justify." For the first time since entering the kitchen, Isaiah's expression softened slightly. "Your time in Philadelphia changed you." "It opened my eyes," Eleanor acknowledged. "But the choice to act on what I've seen is mine alone." For the next hour, Eleanor guided Jacob through the basic shapes and sounds of the alphabet. Despite his injuries, he proved an eager and quick student, his focus absolute, his determination palpable. Isaiah, who she discovered already knew some basics of reading from his previous master's children, helped reinforce the lessons. As they worked, the rigid social barriers between them seemed to recede slightly, replaced by the shared intimacy of forbidden knowledge being passed from one human being to another. Eleanor found herself relaxing, even laughing when Jacob's attempts at pronunciation took unexpected turns. It was during one such moment of unguarded camaraderie that the door to the summer kitchen burst open. Eleanor looked up, the smile freezing on her face as Overseer Simmons stood framed in the doorway, a lantern raised high, illuminating the damning tableau before him. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then Simmons's face contorted with a dark triumph as he took in the scene. The open book, the three of them seated as equals at the table. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice thick with satisfaction. "What have we here? A reading lesson. How very enlightened of you, Miss Hargrove." Behind him, two more figures appeared. Field hands, who served as Simmons's enforcers when physical punishment was required. They carried whips and chains, their expressions grimly anticipatory. Eleanor rose to her feet, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "This is my property, Mr. Simmons, and these are my people. I will educate them as I see fit." Simmons's laugh was ugly. "Not according to Mississippi law, you won't." He gestured to his men. "Take them." Isaiah moved with startling speed, placing himself between Eleanor and the advancing men. "Run, Miss Eleanor," he urged, his voice low and urgent. "Go to the main house, lock yourself in. This isn't your fight." But it was her fight. Eleanor knew that with sudden, crystal clarity. Every instinct told her to flee, to save herself, to use her position and privilege as a shield. Instead, she stood her ground beside Isaiah, her hand finding his in the shadows. "I am the owner of Riverside Plantation," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of generations of Hargroves. "These men are under my protection. You will stand down, Mr. Simmons, or you will find yourself without employment by morning." Simmons's face darkened with rage. "You stupid girl! You think your name protects you? You think society will tolerate a nigger lover in their midst?" He spat the vile word, advancing into the room. "By the time I'm done spreading word of what I found here tonight, you'll be ruined. Your precious Riverside will be sold off to pay your debts, and your friends here will be sold south, where they break troublemakers properly." The threat hung in the air, its credibility undeniable. In the deeply conservative society of 1849 Mississippi, the scandal of a plantation mistress teaching enslaved people to read, sitting with them as equals, would indeed be ruinous. Eleanor would be ostracized, her reputation destroyed. Banks would call in loans, neighbors would shun her, the legal system itself would stand against her. Yet in that moment, with Isaiah's hand warm and strong in hers, Eleanor felt a strange, liberating clarity. The path before her was dangerous, the cost enormous. But for the first time since returning to Riverside, she was acting in accordance with her true conscience. "Then so be it," she said quietly. Simmons' eyes narrowed as he registered the defiance in her tone. His gaze dropped to where her hand clasped Isaiah's, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Oh, I see how it is," he drawled. "It ain't just reading lessons happening in this kitchen, is it?" He turned to his men. Take the boy first. 20 lashes. Make sure Miss Hargrove watches every stroke. Aye. As the men advanced, Eleanor felt Isaiah's grip tighten on hers, a silent communication passing between them. In that moment, something shifted irrevocably. The carefully maintained social order of Riverside Plantation, of Mississippi itself, trembled on the edge of chaos. And in the flickering lamplight of the summer kitchen, 3 lives balanced on the precipice of a decision from which there could be no return. "Stop!" Eleanor's voice cut through the tension, commanding in a way that momentarily froze everyone in place. "Mr. Simmons, before you take another step, consider carefully what you're about to do." Simmons sneered, though he paused. "Giving orders now, Miss Hargrove, to protect your stable master?" The insinuation in his tone was unmistakable. Eleanor released Isaiah's hand, but didn't step away from him. Instead, she straightened her spine, channeling every ounce of her father's authority. "I am reminding you of your position on this plantation. You are an employee. These men," she gestured to Isaiah and Jacob, "are my property under the law. Whatever your personal feelings, you have no right to issue punishments without my consent. The law gives me every right when the crime is teaching slaves to read," Simmons countered, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. Despite his bluster, he was still a man employed by a woman who could dismiss him with a word. "And who will testify to what you saw here tonight?" Eleanor challenged, her mind racing ahead. "These men?" She nodded toward Simmons's enforcers. "Their word against mine would be meaningless in any court. As for you," her voice dropped, becoming dangerously soft. "My father kept meticulous records, Mr. Simmons, including detailed accounts of certain discrepancies in the cotton shipments under your supervision." It was a shot in the dark. Eleanor had indeed found irregularities in the plantation accounts, though nothing conclusive, but the flash of alarm in Simmons's eyes told her the arrow had found its mark. "You threatening me, Miss Hargrove?" Simmons' hand drifted to the whip at his belt. "I'm offering you a choice," Eleanor replied evenly. "Leave Riverside tonight. Take a month's wages and go. Find employment elsewhere, far from Natchez County. Or stay and face the consequences of challenging the daughter of Colonel William Hargrove in her own home." A tense silence filled the summer kitchen. Isaiah and Jacob remained perfectly still, their faces carefully blank, though Eleanor could sense the coiled tension in both men. Simmons's enforcers shifted uneasily, their loyalty clearly wavering as the confrontation escalated beyond what they had anticipated. Finally, Simmons spat on the floor. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "High-minded northern notions won't protect you for long. This is Mississippi, girl. There are rules here older than your family name." "Then I suggest you seek employment with someone who better upholds those rules," Eleanor replied coldly. "Your position at Riverside is terminated, effective immediately. Collect your belongings and be off the property by dawn." For a moment, Eleanor thought Simmons might physically attack her. His face contorted with rage, his knuckles white around the handle of his whip. Then, abruptly, he turned and stormed from the kitchen, his men following uncertainly behind him. When the door slammed shut, Eleanor's legs nearly buckled beneath her. She gripped the edge of the table, suddenly aware of how terribly she was trembling. "Miss Eleanor." Isaiah's voice was soft, concerned. "Are you all right?" She nodded, unable to speak immediately. The enormity of what had just occurred, what she had just done, was crashing over her in waves. She had dismissed Riverside's overseer, threatened him with exposure, defended 2 enslaved men who had been caught in the criminal act of learning to read. And she had done it all while standing beside Isaiah, their hands clasped in a gesture that transcended the rigid racial boundaries of their world. "He won't go quietly," Isaiah warned, his voice low. "Men like Simmons don't accept defeat, especially not from a woman." "I know," Eleanor said, finding her voice at last, "but I couldn't let him hurt you, either of you." She turned to Jacob, who was standing frozen, his young face a mask of fear. Are you all right? Jacob nodded jerkily, clearly still processing the confrontation he had witnessed. Yes, Miss Eleanor, but Isaiah's right. Mr. Simmons is dangerous. He has friends in town, men who think like him. He'll spread rumors, Isaiah added grimly, about tonight, about us. The implications hung heavy in the air. In the deeply segregated society of antebellum Mississippi, even the suggestion of inappropriate relations between a white woman and an enslaved man could provoke murderous violence. The merest whisper of such an accusation could destroy Eleanor's reputation and place Isaiah in mortal danger. Then we must act quickly, Eleanor decided, her mind racing ahead. Jacob returned to the quarters. Say nothing of tonight to anyone. She turned to Isaiah. I need you to gather a few trusted men. We must secure the plantation before Simmons can cause any mischief on his way out. Isaiah nodded, already moving toward the door. I know who to ask. Men who won't talk. After they had gone, Eleanor sank onto the bench, her legs no longer able to support her. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows across the rough walls of the summer kitchen. In the space of a single evening, everything had changed. There was no going back to the carefully ordered existence she had known before. She thought of Phineas Thornton, of his persistent courtship and thinly veiled threats, of the neighboring plantation owners who had been circling since her father's death, waiting for her to fail or marry, expecting a young woman to be incapable of managing Riverside's complex operations, of the society ladies in Natchez who had tolerated her Philadelphia education as an eccentric affectation, never suspecting that it had fundamentally altered her view of the world they shared. By morning, Simmons would undoubtedly be spreading his poison throughout the county. Speculation would run rampant, questions would be asked, and Eleanor would find herself facing a community united in its determination to maintain the status quo at any cost. Yet despite the danger, despite the near certainty of difficult days ahead, Eleanor felt a strange sense of liberation. For years, she had lived with the growing dissonance between her private convictions and public compliance. Tonight, that false harmony had shattered, replaced by a clarity of purpose that, while terrifying, felt undeniably right. She gathered the primer and extinguished the lamp, making her way back to the main house through the moonlit grounds. The night was eerily silent, as though Riverside itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what the coming dawn would bring. In her bedroom, Eleanor changed into her nightdress mechanically, her mind still racing with contingency plans. Sleep seemed impossible, yet she knew she would need all her strength for the challenges ahead. She was just about to extinguish her bedside lamp when a soft knock sounded at her door. "Who is it?" she called, tension returning to her body. "It's Mary, Miss Eleanor." The house servant's voice was hushed, urgent. "May I come in? It's important." Eleanor opened the door to find Mary's usually composed face drawn with worry. "What is it? What's happened?" Mary glanced nervously down the hallway before entering the room, closing the door softly behind her. "It's Mr. Simmons, miss. He's in the barn with some of his men. They're drinking and talking wild. Talking about burning the cotton gin before they leave." Eleanor's blood ran cold. A fire in the gin house could spread to the fields, the quarters, even the main house itself. "How do you know this?" "Kitchen boy heard them," Mary whispered. "He was hiding in the loft, came running to tell me." For a moment, Eleanor considered summoning help from neighboring plantations. But the nearest was 3 miles away, and by the time help arrived, it might be too late. Besides, involving the neighbors would mean explanations, questions about why her overseer was threatening destruction of her property. "Find Isaiah," she decided. "Tell him to meet me at the main house with whatever men he's gathered. And Mary, be careful. Stay out of sight." After Mary departed, Eleanor moved quickly to her father's room. The colonel had been a military man, a veteran of the Mexican War. In the bottom drawer of his bureau, beneath neatly folded linens, lay a polished mahogany box. Eleanor opened it with hands that trembled only slightly, revealing 2 dueling pistols nestled in red velvet. They had been presented to her father by his commanding officer, a token of respect from one soldier to another. Eleanor had fired them only once, under her father's careful supervision. The memory of their weight, their recoil, came back to her as she lifted one from its velvet bed. She checked that it was loaded, then tucked it into the pocket of her robe. The second pistol she left in its case. One was burden enough. By the time she reached the main hall, Isaiah was waiting, along with 4 other men she recognized from the stables and fields. Their faces were grim, determined. They had gathered what weapons they could: pitchforks, a scythe, heavy wooden staves. "Mary told us," Isaiah said without preamble, "about Simmons." Eleanor nodded, addressing the group with a calmness she didn't entirely feel. "We need to stop them before they can do any damage. If they've been drinking, they may be careless, dangerous. I don't want anyone hurt if it can be avoided." "They won't expect us to know their plans," Isaiah observed. "We have that advantage, at least." Eleanor made a quick decision. "Isaiah and I will approach from the front. The rest of you circle around to the rear of the barn. If Simmons and his men try to run, detain them." She hesitated, then added, "Use whatever force is necessary, but no more." The weight of what she was asking, for enslaved men to physically restrain white men, was not lost on anyone present. In the ordinary course of life on a Mississippi plantation, such an action would be unthinkable, punishable by the most severe measures. Yet these were not ordinary circumstances. "You understand what I'm asking?" Eleanor said quietly. "The risk." One of the men, an older field hand named Solomon, stepped forward. "We understand, Miss Eleanor. Riverside is our home too. We won't let them burn it down." With a nod of acknowledgement, Eleanor led the way out into the night. The barn stood some distance from the main house, a looming shadow against the star-filled sky. As they drew closer, the soft glow of lantern light spilled from its partially open doors, along with the sound of rough male laughter and the occasional crash of a bottle. "Wait here," Eleanor whispered to Isaiah when they were within 50 yards of the entrance. "Let me try to reason with them first." Isaiah's expression was skeptical. "Miss Eleanor, they won't listen to reason, not in their current state." "Perhaps not," she conceded, "but I must try. If they see you first with me, it will only inflame the situation." Before Isaiah could object further, Eleanor stepped from the shadows and walked purposefully toward the barn doors. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she was acutely aware of the pistol's weight in her pocket. She had never aimed a weapon at another human being. The prospect of doing so now filled her with dread, yet she could see no alternative path. She paused at the entrance, taking in the scene before her. Simmons and 3 other men, 2 she recognized as his regular enforcers, the third a drifter who sometimes worked odd jobs around the plantation, were gathered around a makeshift table formed from an upturned barrel. Bottles of whiskey were scattered around them, several empty, others in various states of consumption. A lantern burned dangerously close to a pile of hay, its flame flickering with each drunken movement of the men. Most alarmingly, a small barrel sat nearby. Kerosene, Eleanor guessed, intended for the cotton gin. The men's faces were flushed with drink and anger, their conversation a crude mixture of threats and boasts. "I think that's quite enough, mister." "Simmons," Eleanor called, stepping fully into the doorway. The men's heads snapped up in unison, expressions of surprise quickly giving way to malicious delight. "Well, look who it is," Simmons drawled, rising unsteadily to his feet. "The high and mighty Miss Hargrove herself. Come to see us off, have you?" "I've come to ensure you leave without further incident," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice level, despite the fear coursing through her. "Your belongings will be sent to whatever address you provide. There's no need for additional unpleasantness." Simmons laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Unpleasantness? That what you call it when you side with slaves against your own kind? When you hold secret meetings with your buck in the night?" The crude insinuation brought a flush of anger to Eleanor's cheeks, but she maintained her composure. I won't dignify such accusations with a response, Mr. Simmons. I simply want you off my property, peacefully by morning. Your property? Simmons spat on the ground. You won't have property much longer, girl. Not once word gets out about what you've been doing. He took an unsteady step toward her. Maybe I should take you back to town with me right now. Let folks see what Colonel Hargrove's daughter has become. Eleanor's hand slipped into her pocket, fingers closing around the pistol's grip. I wouldn't advise coming any closer, Mr. Simmons. He sneered, taking another step. Or what? You'll swoon. Call for help? Ain't nobody coming, Miss Hargrove. Just you and us out here. With a smooth motion that surprised even herself, Eleanor withdrew the pistol and aimed it steadily at Simmons's chest. I said, "Stay where you are." The overseer froze, his bloodshot eyes widening in shock. Behind him, his companions scrambled to their feet, their drunken bravado visibly deflating at the sight of the weapon. "Now," Eleanor continued, her voice remarkably calm, "you will all leave Riverside immediately. Take only what you can carry. The rest will be sent on." Simmons's face contorted with rage. "You wouldn't dare use that. My father taught me to shoot, Mr. Simmons. And while I've never had cause to aim at a man before, I assure you I won't hesitate if you force my hand." For a tense moment, the scene balanced on a knife's edge. Then, with shocking swiftness, Simmons lunged toward the kerosene barrel, upending it. The pungent liquid splashed across the barn floor, soaking the hay, running in rivulets toward Eleanor's feet. "Burn it all!" Buddy Simmons shouted, his face twisted with hatred. "Let's see how the nigger lover manages when her precious cotton is ash." One of his companions, caught up in the madness of the moment, grabbed the lantern, preparing to throw it into the kerosene-soaked hay. "No," Eleanor cried, raising the pistol higher. "Stop, or I'll—" The sound of the shot was deafening in the confined space of the barn, echoing off the wooden walls. For an instant, everyone froze in tableau. Eleanor with the smoking pistol extended, Simmons halfway to the door, his companions in various states of shock. Then the man holding the lantern crumpled slowly to the ground, the glass shattering as it hit the barn floor. The flame caught immediately in the spilled kerosene, blue fire racing across the wooden planks with terrifying speed. "Fire!" Isaiah's voice came from just behind Eleanor, followed by the sound of running feet as the men who had been waiting outside rushed in. "Everyone out! Now!" Chaos erupted as Simmons and his remaining men bolted for the door, colliding with Isaiah and the others in a confusion of shouts and flailing limbs. Eleanor stood frozen, the pistol still extended, watching in horror as the flames spread rapidly toward the stored hay. "Miss Eleanor!" Isaiah was suddenly beside her, his hand closing over hers, lowering the gun. "We need to go, now!" His voice broke through her shock, and she allowed him to pull her toward the door. Behind them, the fire had reached the hay bales, which erupted in a roar of orange flame. The heat at their backs was intense, pushing them forward into the cool night air. Outside, figures struggled in the flickering firelight. Simmons and one of his men had broken free and were running toward the woods that bordered the plantation. The other enforcer was being held firmly by Solomon and another field hand. Of the man Eleanor had shot, there was no sign. "Did I—" she began, her voice shaking. "Is he—" "Wounded, not dead," Isaiah assured her quickly. "They dragged him out. He'll live." Relief washed over Eleanor, though it was quickly tempered by the realization of how narrowly they had avoided catastrophe. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames leaping high into the night sky. If the fire spread to the nearby fields or outbuildings. As if reading her thoughts, Isaiah turned to the gathered men. "We need to contain this. Solomon, take 2 men and make sure the fire doesn't reach the cotton gin. The rest of you form a bucket chain from the well." The men moved with surprising efficiency, years of working together creating an unspoken coordination. Eleanor found herself joining the bucket chain, her fine nightdress and robe soon soaked and smeared with soot as she passed water from hand to hand. For hours they fought the fire, joined gradually by enslaved people from the quarters who had seen the flames and come running to help. By the time the barn collapsed in on itself, a smouldering ruin of charred timbers and ash, dawn was breaking over Riverside. Eleanor stood apart from the others, watching as the flames finally subsided. Her hands were blistered, her face streaked with soot, her clothing ruined. The pistol was tucked back in her pocket, a leaden weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. She had fired a weapon at another human being, had wounded him, could easily have killed him. The fact that she had done so in defense of her home to prevent a greater tragedy offered little comfort in the cold light of morning. More troubling still were the implications of what had occurred. Simmons would not remain silent. By now he was likely making his way to town, preparing to spread his version of events. A story of a plantation mistress gone mad, siding with slaves against whites, teaching them to read, perhaps even more scandalous accusations. And there was truth in his claims, however distorted. Eleanor had indeed begun teaching Jacob to read. She had defied the social order, had enlisted enslaved men to help defend the plantation against white men, had stood with Isaiah as an equal, had taken his hand in hers. In the strict social hierarchy of 1849 Mississippi, these were unforgivable transgressions. The community's response would be swift and merciless. "Miss Eleanor," Isaiah approached cautiously, his expression grave. "We should get you back to the house. People will be coming soon, when they see the smoke." Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of how exposed she was, standing amid the ruins in her nightclothes, surrounded by enslaved people, no white overseer in sight. The impropriety of the scene would only add fuel to the rumors Simmons would undoubtedly spread. As they walked back toward the main house, the full weight of her situation descended upon her. In the space of a single night, Eleanor Hargrove, respectable plantation mistress and daughter of a distinguished family, had become something else entirely. A woman who had defied convention, broken the law, fired a weapon at a white man, and stood alongside the enslaved as equals. There would be consequences, severe ones. The society in which she had been raised tolerated many things, but it would not tolerate this. Yet despite the danger ahead, despite the certainty of scandal and possibly worse, Eleanor felt a strange, quiet resolve taking root within her. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. As they reached the main house, the sun was rising fully over Riverside, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. In the distance, the charred skeleton of the barn stood as a stark reminder of the night's events. Beyond it, the fields stretched to the horizon, where men and women would soon begin another day of forced labor. Isaiah paused at the bottom of the steps, maintaining the proper distance, now that they were in full view of anyone who might be watching from the house. "What happens now, Miss Eleanor?" he asked, his voice low. Eleanor looked out over Riverside, the plantation that had been her family's for generations, built and maintained by the labor of those they had enslaved. In the harsh light of morning, she saw it clearly for what it was, a beautiful place founded on a terrible injustice. "Now," she said softly, "everything changes." By mid-morning, Riverside Plantation was alive with whispers. The news of the confrontation with Overseer Simmons, the midnight fire, and Eleanor's unprecedented actions spread rapidly through the quarters and the fields, each telling embellishing or diminishing details according to the teller's perspective. Eleanor had retired briefly to change her clothes and wash away the worst of the smoke and grime, but rest was impossible. Too much needed to be done, too many decisions to be made before the inevitable reckoning arrived from town. In the Colonel's study, her study now, she sat at the massive desk, pen in hand, drafting a letter to her father's lawyer in Natchez. Mr. Abernathy was a conservative man of the old school, but he had always treated Eleanor with respect, recognizing in her the same sharp intelligence he had admired in her father. If anyone could help navigate the legal storm that was surely brewing, it would be him. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, setting down her pen. Mary entered, her usually composed features tight with anxiety. "Miss Eleanor, there are riders coming, a group of men from town." Eleanor's stomach clenched, but she kept her expression neutral. "How many?" "6 or 7, miss. Mr. Thornton is among them." Of course. Phineas Thornton would not miss an opportunity to insert himself into a situation that might advance his ambitions regarding Riverside. Eleanor rose from the desk, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled only slightly. "Have Isaiah meet me on the front porch," she instructed. "Tell him to stay in the background, but within earshot. I want him to hear whatever is said." Mary's eyes widened at the unusual request, but she nodded and hurried away. Eleanor took a moment to compose herself, drawing a deep breath before making her way to the front of the house. The group of riders was just coming up the main drive as Eleanor stepped onto the veranda. She recognized all of them, prominent men from Natchez and the surrounding plantations. Mr. Thornton rode at their head, his expression grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Behind him came Judge Wilkins, whose circuit court covered 3 counties, Mr. Bradford, who owned the neighboring plantation to the east, Reverend Miller from the Episcopal Church in town, and 3 other planters whose properties bordered Riverside. A delegation, then, not a lynch mob, which had been her worst fear when Mary mentioned riders approaching. These men had come to pass judgment, not to exact immediate vengeance. Small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Eleanor stood at the top of the steps, her posture straight, her chin lifted in unconscious imitation of her father's dignified bearing. She was aware of Isaiah's presence behind her, a shadow in the doorway of the house, listening as instructed. "Gentlemen," she called, as the riders drew to a halt in the circular drive. "To what do I owe this visit?" Thornton dismounted first, handing his reins to a waiting stable boy. The others followed suit, forming a semicircle at the foot of the steps, their faces solemn beneath the morning sun. "Miss Hargrove," Thornton began, removing his hat, "we've come on a matter of some urgency. May we speak privately?" "Whatever you have to say can be said here, Mr. Thornton," Eleanor replied coolly. "These are unusual times at Riverside, as I'm sure you've heard. I prefer to conduct all business in the open." Thornton's expression tightened, but he nodded curtly. "Very well. We have received some disturbing reports regarding incidents at Riverside last night. Your overseer, Mr. Simmons, arrived in town early this morning with quite a tale to tell." "I imagine he did," Eleanor said dryly, "though I wonder how closely his tale resembles the truth." Judge Wilkins stepped forward, his jowled face flushed with the heat and the gravity of the situation. "Miss Hargrove, Simmons claims you discharged him without cause, then later threatened him at gunpoint when he attempted to collect his belongings. He says you fired upon him and his men, wounding one, and that the resulting confusion led to the barn fire. Most seriously, he alleges that you have been engaged in inappropriate activities with certain of your slaves." The last accusation hung in the air, its implication clear to everyone present. In the rigid racial hierarchy of the antebellum South, few accusations could be more damaging to a white woman's reputation than the suggestion of intimacy with an enslaved man. Eleanor felt a flush of anger rising in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "Mr. Simmons was indeed discharged, Judge Wilkins, but hardly without cause. He administered an excessive and unauthorized punishment to one of my people, then directly challenged my authority when I questioned him about it. As for the events of last night, he and his associates attempted to burn my cotton gin after their dismissal. The pistol was fired in defense of my property, and the barn caught fire when a lantern was dropped during the confusion." "And the other accusation?" Reverend Miller inquired, his voice gentle but probing. "Simmons claims he discovered you engaged in teaching one of your slaves to read, that you were seated at a table with them as equals." Eleanor hesitated only briefly. Denying the truth would be the simplest path, her word against Simmons's. But she had stepped onto a different road the previous night, and there could be no turning back now. "I was indeed teaching Jacob to read," she admitted, causing a ripple of shocked murmurs among the assembled men. "Specifically to read the Bible. I find it difficult to reconcile our Christian duty to spread God's word with laws forbidding certain people from accessing that word directly." Reverend Miller's eyebrows rose, clearly taken aback by her theological challenge. Before he could respond, Bradford stepped forward, his weathered face darkening with anger. "This is precisely the sort of dangerous thinking we've feared since you returned from Philadelphia, Miss Hargrove," he declared. "Northern abolitionist nonsense, polluting the mind of a Southern lady. Your father would be ashamed." Eleanor felt a flash of genuine anger at the invocation of her father. "You did not know my father's mind as I did, Mr. Bradford. The Colonel was a complex man, capable of growth and change. I believe he would have come to see the moral inconsistency of our position, given time and the proper influence." "This is absurd," Thornton interjected. "Colonel Hargrove was a pillar of this community precisely because he understood and upheld our way of life. Our very civilization depends upon maintaining proper order between the races. A civilization built on the backs of enslaved people is no civilization at all, Mr. Thornton," Eleanor replied, the words emerging before she could temper them. "It is a house built on sand, destined to fall." A shocked silence followed her declaration. Even the birds seemed to have ceased their morning songs, as though the very air had stilled in response to her heresy. Judge Wilkins was the first to recover, his legal mind already calculating the implications. "Miss Hargrove, do you realize the position in which you have placed yourself? Teaching slaves to read is a criminal offense in Mississippi. If formal charges are brought, will you be the one to bring them, Judge?" Eleanor interrupted, meeting his gaze directly. "Will you prosecute a woman for teaching God's word?" The judge shifted uncomfortably. "The law makes no exceptions for religious instruction. The legislature has determined that literacy among the enslaved population poses too great a risk to public safety." "Because knowledge is power," Eleanor said softly, "and heaven forbid we share power with those we have subjugated." Bradford made a disgusted sound, turning to the others. "This is worse than I feared. She's not merely misguided, she's become a full-fledged abolitionist. If word of this spreads, it could inflame sentiments throughout the county. We cannot allow such dangerous ideas to take root here." "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Bradford?" Eleanor asked, a chill running down her spine despite the warmth of the morning. It was Thornton who answered, stepping forward with an expression of grave concern that did not quite mask the calculation in his eyes. "Miss Hargrove, we have conferred and believe the best course of action is clear. For your own protection and for the stability of the community, Riverside should be placed under different management until such time as you recover your proper perspective." "You want to take my plantation from me," Eleanor said flatly. "Not permanently," Thornton assured her, his tone condescending. "Think of it as a temporary guardianship. You would retain ownership in name, while the day-to-day management would fall to a committee of trusted neighbors. I would be honored to lead such a committee, of course." Eleanor almost laughed at the transparent ploy. Thornton had been maneuvering to gain control of Riverside since her father's death. The events of the previous night had simply provided him with the pretext he needed. "And if I refuse," Judge Wilkins cleared his throat, "then I'm afraid formal charges would need to be considered. Teaching slaves to read, inciting them against white authority, discharging a firearm at a white man, these are serious offenses, Miss Hargrove. The penalties could be severe." The threat was clear. Either surrender control of Riverside voluntarily or face legal consequences that could include fines, imprisonment, and the forced sale of the plantation and all its assets, including the people who lived and worked there. Eleanor felt a moment of despair, quickly replaced by cold anger. These men had come not out of concern for her welfare, but to protect their own interests, to ensure that the system that benefited them remained unchallenged. They feared not just what she had done, but what her actions represented, a crack in the foundation of the society they had built. "I will need time to consider your proposal," she said finally, her mind racing ahead to possible strategies. "This is not a decision to be made hastily." Thornton nodded, clearly satisfied that he had won the first skirmish. "Of course. We are reasonable men, Miss Hargrove. We understand that recent events have been trying for you. Take today to reflect. We will return tomorrow morning for your answer." As the men remounted their horses and rode back down the drive, Eleanor remained on the porch, her outward composure masking the turmoil within. Only when they had disappeared from sight did she allow her shoulders to sag slightly, the weight of her situation pressing down upon her. "They mean to take Riverside from you." Isaiah's voice came from behind her, quiet but intense. "One way or another." Eleanor turned to face him, noting the tension in his powerful frame, the barely contained anger in his eyes. "Yes," she agreed simply. "They do. What will you do?" It was the question that had been echoing in her mind since the confrontation with Simmons, growing more urgent with each passing hour. What would she do? What could she do? A single woman against the combined might of law, custom, and communal will. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Eleanor felt a curious sense of clarity emerging from the chaos of her thoughts. For the first time in her life, she was seeing the world as it truly was, without the comforting illusions that had sheltered her from harsh realities. And with that clarity came a determination that surprised her with its intensity. "I will not surrender Riverside to men like Thornton," she declared, her voice steady, despite the enormity of what she was contemplating. "Nor will I continue to participate in a system I know to be fundamentally wrong." Isaiah studied her face, searching for something in her expression. "What are you saying, Miss Eleanor?" Eleanor glanced around to ensure they were truly alone, before continuing in a lower voice. "There is a third option, Isaiah, one that Thornton and his allies have not considered, because they cannot imagine a woman would be bold enough to attempt it." Understanding dawned in Isaiah's eyes. "You're thinking of leaving." "Not just leaving," Eleanor clarified. "Taking Riverside with me, or at least its most valuable assets." Isaiah's expression shifted from surprise to wariness. "You mean the people?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "Those who wish to go. I would not force anyone, but I can offer a choice that has never before been available." She took a deep breath, the plan forming more clearly as she spoke it aloud. "North to Ohio, perhaps, or farther. There are communities where former slaves have established themselves, where they live as free men and women." Isaiah was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "That would mean abandoning everything, your home, your position in society. You would be ostracized, possibly prosecuted if caught. And the journey itself would be dangerous, especially for a white woman traveling with black companions." "I am aware of the risks," Eleanor said quietly, "but I see no other path that I could walk with a clear conscience." Another silence fell between them, heavier now with the weight of the decision being contemplated. Eleanor waited, understanding that what she was suggesting would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone at Riverside. It was not a choice to be made lightly or alone. "Why?" Isaiah asked finally, the simple question containing worlds of meaning. "Why would you sacrifice everything for people who were, until yesterday, your property?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. It deserved a thoughtful answer, not a pat platitude about Christian charity or moral duty. "Because I have come to believe that there are times when the cost of remaining comfortable is too high," she said slowly. "When I was in Philadelphia, I met a woman who had been enslaved in Virginia. She had escaped north with her children, walking hundreds of miles through wilderness, risking capture and punishment at every step. When I asked her how she found the courage, she told me, 'There comes a point when you can no longer live with what you know. when staying becomes more painful than leaving. Eleanor met Isaiah's gaze directly. "I have reached that point, Isaiah." Something shifted in his expression then, a softening around the eyes, a subtle relaxation of his guarded posture. "If you're serious about this, we need to move quickly. Thornton and the others will be watching closely. And we'll need help, trustworthy people who know the routes north." "The Underground Railroad," Eleanor said, the term still unfamiliar on her tongue. She had heard whispers of the secret network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom, but had never imagined she might one day need its assistance. Isaiah nodded cautiously. "There are connections, people who know people, but it will take time to reach out to them safely." "Time we don't have," Eleanor pointed out. "Thornton returns tomorrow for my answer." Then we need to delay him," Isaiah said, his mind clearly shifting to practical considerations. "Give him an answer that buys us a few days at least." Eleanor nodded, a strategy already forming in her mind. "I'll tell them I need to consult with Mr. Abernathy, my father's lawyer, that I want his advice before making such a significant decision. They can hardly object to that." "And while they're waiting," Isaiah prompted, "while they're waiting, we prepare." Eleanor's voice dropped even lower. "Select those who wish to go, gather provisions, make arrangements, and reach out to your connections." A hint of a smile touched Isaiah's lips, the first she had seen from him in their years of acquaintance. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Eleanor." "Eleanor," she corrected gently. "If we're to undertake this journey together, we should at least use each other's names properly." Isaiah hesitated, years of conditioning making the simple act of addressing a white woman by her first name nearly unthinkable. "Eleanor," he said finally, the name emerging soft and tentative, a first step across a boundary that had previously seemed impenetrable. As the day progressed, Eleanor moved through Riverside with a strange sense of detachment, as though seeing the plantation for the first time, or perhaps the last. The grand house, with its imposing columns and sweeping verandas, the manicured gardens, the fields stretching to the horizon, all of it familiar, yet suddenly alien. A beautiful prison she had never recognized as such until now. In the afternoon, she summoned Mary to her study, and after ensuring the door was securely closed, shared her plans in hushed tones. Mary listened without interruption, her expression revealing nothing until Eleanor had finished speaking. "You truly mean to do this?" Mary said finally, not a question but a statement of wonderment. "I do," Eleanor confirmed. "But as I told Isaiah, I will force no one. The choice must be yours, and it must be made with full understanding of the risks." Mary was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, as though seeing beyond the walls of Riverside to possibilities previously unimagined. "My sister was sold south 3 years ago," she said finally, "to a plantation in Louisiana. I've never stopped thinking about her, wondering if she's alive, if she has children who will be born into bondage." She refocused on Eleanor, her expression resolute. "I would go north, Miss Eleanor, and I believe many others would too if given the chance. Then we will need your help identifying who can be trusted with this knowledge, who wishes to go, and who would prefer to remain." "There will be those who stay," Mary warned, "out of fear or because family ties bind them here." Eleanor nodded, understanding the complex web of relationships and circumstances that might influence each person's decision. "We will respect their choice and do what we can to protect them from any consequences of our departure." As evening approached, Eleanor wrote her letter to Mr. Abernathy, carefully outlining the situation without revealing her true intentions. The attorney was a man of principle, but also deeply embedded in Southern society. She could not risk him alerting Thornton or the authorities to her plans. After sealing the letter, she sat for a long time at her father's desk, running her fingers over the polished mahogany surface, thinking of the man who had raised her. Colonel William Hargrove had been a product of his time and place, a man who had never questioned the institution of slavery, who had viewed his ownership of other human beings as both a right and a responsibility. Yet he had also been a man of honor in his way, who had valued justice and fair treatment within the confines of a system he accepted as natural. What would he think of his daughter now? Would he see her actions as a betrayal of his legacy, or as its ultimate fulfillment? The question had no answer, and Eleanor finally set it aside, focusing instead on the practical matters at hand. By nightfall, the initial plans were in place. Isaiah had sent a trusted messenger to contact potential allies in Natchez, while Mary had begun quietly spreading word among the quarters, gauging who might wish to join their exodus north. Eleanor retired to her bedroom early, though sleep remained elusive. Through her window, she could see the distant flicker of fires in the quarters, hear the soft strains of singing that rose into the night air, songs of sorrow, of faith, of coded messages that had always been there, had she only listened closely enough to hear them. Tomorrow, she would face Thornton and the others, would play for time, would set in motion a plan that would forever change her life and the lives of all at Riverside. The path ahead was fraught with danger, the outcome far from certain. Yet despite the risks, despite the knowledge that she was abandoning everything familiar for an uncertain future, Eleanor felt a curious sense of peace. For the first time since returning to Riverside, perhaps for the first time in her life, she was acting in full accordance with her deepest convictions. Whatever came next, freedom or capture, success or failure, she would face it without the burden of complicity in a system she could no longer abide. A soft knock at her door roused Eleanor from her thoughts. "Yes?" she called, drawing her robe more securely around herself. The door opened slightly to reveal Mary's concerned face. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Eleanor, but Isaiah says you need to come quickly. There's news from town." Alarm coursed through Eleanor as she followed Mary down the servants' staircase and out into the night. Had their plans been discovered already? Had Thornton somehow learned of their intentions? Isaiah was waiting in the shadow of the kitchen garden, his tall figure unmistakable even in the darkness. Beside him stood a young man Eleanor recognized as one of the stable hands, his clothing dusty from travel. "What is it?" she asked, approaching quickly. "What's happened?" Isaiah's expression was grave. "Nathan here works for Mr. Patterson in town sometimes, at the freight office. He overheard something we need to know." Nathan stepped forward, removing his cap nervously. "Miss Hargrove, I was sweeping up at the office when Mr. Thornton came in with Mr. Bradford. They were talking about tomorrow's meeting with you. Mr. Thornton said—" He hesitated, glancing at Isaiah for reassurance before continuing. "He said no matter what you decided, they were going to place Riverside under protective management, that papers were already being drawn up, and Judge Wilkins had agreed to sign them." Eleanor felt a chill despite the warmth of the spring night. "They never intended to give me a choice at all." "There's more," Nathan continued reluctantly. "Mr. Thornton specifically mentioned Isaiah, said he was a dangerous influence who needed to be removed immediately." The young man swallowed hard. "They're planning to sell him south, miss, to New Orleans." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The threat was not merely to her control of Riverside, but to Isaiah himself. The New Orleans slave markets were notorious for their brutality, the conditions on the sugar plantations even worse than those on cotton plantations like Riverside. It was a death sentence, thinly disguised as a legal transaction. "When?" she demanded, her voice tight with urgency. "When are they planning this?" "Tomorrow," Nathan replied, "after they meet with you. Mr. Bradford has already arranged for a slave trader to be waiting." Eleanor turned to Isaiah, whose face remained impassive despite the dire news. Only his eyes betrayed his understanding of what awaited him if Thornton's plan succeeded. "We need to leave tonight," Eleanor decided, the last vestiges of hesitation vanishing in the face of this immediate threat. "Now, if possible." Those who wish to come must be ready within the hour. Isaiah nodded, his mind clearly already racing ahead to practical considerations. We can take the north road. Avoid town entirely. There are places in the woods where we can hide during daylight hours. And our contact in Natchez? Eleanor asked, referring to the potential underground railroad connection. We'll have to manage without them for now. Once we're clear of the county, we can seek help farther north. Mary, who had been listening silently, spoke up. I'll gather those who want to go. We've been talking already. More than you might think are willing to take the risk. As Mary hurried away toward the quarters, Eleanor turned back to Isaiah. We'll need provisions, supplies for the journey, and transportation, at least for the first leg. The wagon used for market days, Isaiah suggested. It can carry supplies and those who can't walk far, children, the elderly. Good. And we'll need money. Eleanor's mind raced ahead, calculating what funds she could access quickly. Her personal savings were modest, but there was a cache of gold coins her father had kept in a hidden compartment in his study, intended for emergencies. If this didn't qualify as an emergency, nothing did. As Isaiah moved off to begin preparations, Eleanor caught his arm, stopping him momentarily. Isaiah, she said, her voice low but intense, you don't have to do this. You could leave alone tonight, move faster, safer, without the rest of us slowing you down. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the darkness. Is that what you want me to do? What I want, Eleanor said carefully, is for you to be free, truly free, to make your own choices. A ghost of a smile crossed Isaiah's face. Then let me make this one, he said simply. We go together, or not at all. The next hour passed in a blur of urgent activity. Eleanor returned to the main house, gathering the emergency funds from her father's study and packing a small bag with only the most essential items, a change of clothing, a warm shawl, the pistols from her father's dueling set, a locket containing miniatures of her parents. She changed from her fine dress into the simplest garments she owned, a dark traveling dress, sturdy boots, a plain bonnet that would shade her face. Around her waist, beneath her skirts, she secured a belt containing the gold coins, their weight unfamiliar against her skin. As she worked, she was acutely aware that she was dismantling her life piece by piece, selecting what little she would carry forward and what would be left behind. The elegant furnishings, the family heirlooms, the books and paintings and silver, all of it would remain at Riverside, a silent testimony to the privileged existence she was abandoning. By the time Eleanor emerged from the house for the final time, the wagon was waiting in the shadow of the orchard, loaded with supplies and surrounded by a group of people speaking in hushed tones. Isaiah stood at the head of the team, his hand on the bridle of the lead horse, keeping the nervous animal calm. Mary approached, her expression a mixture of excitement and fear. 23, Miss Eleanor. That's how many are coming. Would be more, but some have family on other plantations they can't bear to leave. Eleanor nodded, understanding the heart-wrenching choices being made that night. And the others, those who are staying. They've promised to say nothing until morning, to claim they knew nothing of our plans. It was the best they could hope for. Once the alarm was raised, those left behind would inevitably face questioning, possibly worse, but a head start of several hours might make the difference between capture and freedom for those fleeing. Eleanor moved through the gathered group, recognizing faces in the dim moonlight. Jacob, still bearing the marks of his recent whipping. Solomon, who had helped fight the barn fire. Hannah, a young woman who worked in the laundry. Old Moses, who had been at Riverside longer than Eleanor had been alive. Children clung to their parents' hands, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. A few carried small bundles, precious items they could not bear to leave behind. "We're ready," Isaiah said, approaching Eleanor. He had changed into dark clothing, with a worn hat pulled low over his face. A knife was sheathed at his belt, its presence a stark reminder of the dangers they might face. Eleanor nodded, taking a last look at the white columns of Riverside Manor, gleaming ghostly in the moonlight. the home of her ancestors, the only place she had ever truly belonged. In a few hours, when the sun rose, it would still stand, solid and permanent, while she would be a fugitive on the road north, her former life receding with each step like a dream upon waking. "Let's go," she said softly, turning her back on Riverside for the last time. The wagon moved slowly up the north road, its progress deliberately quiet, with no lanterns to betray their presence. Those who could walk did so alongside, saving the wagon space for children, the elderly, and their precious supplies. Isaiah led the way, his keen senses alert for any sign of danger, while Eleanor walked near the rear, ensuring no one fell behind. As they crested the first hill, putting Riverside behind them, a peculiar feeling washed over Eleanor, a mixture of grief and liberation, fear and resolve. Whatever lay ahead, there could be no returning to what had been. The road stretched before them, dark and uncertain, leading toward a future none of them could clearly envision. Yet despite the dangers, despite the knowledge that pursuit would soon follow, despite the reality that many of them might never reach their destination, Eleanor felt a curious sense of rightness about their path. For the first time in her life, she was moving forward in full accordance with her deepest convictions, her actions aligned with her beliefs. The night was clear, the stars above them like countless distant lanterns, guiding their way north, toward freedom, toward a new beginning, toward the possibility of a world in which the color of one's skin did not determine one's destiny. A world in which the heiress of Riverside Manor and her stable master could walk side by side as equals, their shared humanity acknowledged without fear or shame. It was a world that did not yet exist, that might never fully exist in their lifetimes. But as the small band of travelers moved steadily northward through the Mississippi night, each step took them closer to its possibility. And for now, for tonight, that possibility was enough to sustain them on their journey into the unknown. The wagon disappeared over the hill, leaving behind only wheel tracks in the soft earth and the echo of a whispered promise that even in the darkest times, in the most entrenched systems of oppression, the human spirit's yearning for freedom could not be extinguished. That courage, conscience, and conviction could sometimes, against all odds, prevail against the weight of history and custom. That the vows exchanged in whispers between an heiress and her stable master could indeed shatter the foundations of a world built on inequality, opening the way for something new and better to take its place.